Okay, welcome to this evening's Power Hour webinar. Tonight's topic is creating a culture for innovation, where we will be discussing how to create a practice environment that is aware and open to innovative new opportunities and possibilities. I'd like to turn things over to Jen Pendo briefly to go over some housekeeping before we get started.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final episode of the RLI Power Hour webinar series. Tonight's topic is on creating a culture for innovation. My name is Jennifer Pendo, and I'm the program manager with the Radiology Leadership Institute. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few logistical items so you know how to participate in tonight's event. Here's an example of the GoToWebinar control panel. You see this, something that looks just like this in the upper right-hand corner of your computer screen. When you joined tonight's webinar, you selected to join either by phone call or computer audio. If you joined by the phone, please be sure to enter your audio pin, which is found in the audio pane section of your control panel. If for any reason you'd like to change your selection, you may do so by accessing your audio pane section. There will be a Q&A session at the end of tonight's webinar. You'll have an option to submit text questions to Dr. Abramson and Dr. Rubin by typing your questions into the questions pane in the control panel. You may send your questions at any time, and Dr. Nathan will collect those and address them at the end. Or if you prefer to ask your question verbally, you may raise your hand by clicking on the hand raising icon in the grab tab at the top left control panel. When you are called on, you will be unmuted, and then you'll be able to ask your question at that point. I'd like to now turn it over to Dr. Nathan, who will introduce our faculty for tonight.
Well, perfect. Thank you, Jen. So I'd like to introduce you to our expert speakers this evening. We have Dr. Abramson and Dr. Rubin. Both are highly accomplished and will be providing us with some excellent insight on this topic. So just a short bio about both of them. Dr. Abramson is an associate professor and vice chair for innovation in the Department of Radiology and Radiological Sciences at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. At Vanderbilt, Dr. Abramson combines active clinical radiology practice with NIH-funded research into quantitative imaging biomarkers and machine learning. In his vice chair role, he directs RADx, Vanderbilt Radiology's Innovation and Entrepreneurship Incubator. Dr. Abramson is an alumnus of the Association of University Radiologists, GE Radiology Research Academic Fellowship. He serves on the board of directors for Vanderbilt Imaging Services, LLC, and on the advisory boards for 2 Nashville-based healthcare venture capital funds. Dr. Rubin, our second speaker this evening, is the George B. Geller Distinguished Professor for Research in Cardiovascular Diseases and Professor of Radiology at Duke University. His current work focuses on applications of artificial intelligence towards assisted interpretation of volumetric medical imaging, the contributions of perceptual variations to radiologist performance in volumetric image interpretation, and effective leadership and management in radiology and healthcare. In support of the latter focus, he is an avid mentor for radiology leaders and has developed and taught several national leadership training programs for the Radiology Leadership Institute of the American College of Radiology, where he has served as a founding board member since 2012. Dr. Rubin is also president and board chair of the International Society for Computed Tomography, board member of RAD8 International, and is co-chair of the RSNA ACR Public Information Website Committee overseeing radiologyinfo.org. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Abramson, who will begin our talk this evening.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Nathan, and welcome to the webinar. We begin our presentation by offering a working definition for innovation to be used throughout this talk. Having a definition for innovation is necessary due to how ubiquitous this word has become in modern life, popping up in everything from fashion to stormwater drainage. Certainly in healthcare, we see innovation as the fashionable buzzword applied to information technology, to new drugs and devices, to new care delivery models, and also appearing within the medical literature at an exponentially increasing rate. There are almost as many definitions for innovation as there are emerging innovations. For our purposes tonight, we will define innovation as the development and implementation of creative ideas for advancing and evolving the mission of an organization, or, more simply put, the purposeful creation of value-enhancing change. If we unpack this latter definition a bit, we see that this phrasing is quite intentional. Innovation does certainly involve change, but change must add value to a firm or organization or industry in order to be considered innovative. Said another way, change simply for change itself is not considered innovation, at least in this construct. In addition, our definition of innovation implies that such value-enhancing change is created purposefully, with intention. This in turn implies that an organization may proactively set about to foster and build those elements that enable and propel innovation. Those elements and how to nurture them within an organization are the topic of tonight's webinar. We also wanted to draw a distinction between two basic kinds of innovation, disruptive and incremental. Disruptive innovation refers to breakthroughs that fundamentally alter an organization's business model and its surrounding market. For example, internet-based commerce was a disruptive innovation that fundamentally altered the market for consumer goods and upended the business model for many brick-and-mortar retailers. Examples of disruptive innovation in radiology might include the introduction of PACS and the advent of teleradiology. Incremental innovation, by contrast, refers to small improvements or additions to an organization that occur while maintaining the organization's core business model. We focus in this webinar on incremental innovation because, unlike disruptive innovation, incremental innovation is broadly accessible to all radiology practices, large and small, and does not necessarily depend on access to deep financial resources, expertise, or an elaborate research and development infrastructure. We propose that incremental innovation is available to all radiology practices, and indeed that it is necessary to sustain a practice and to ensure its competitive viability in a dynamic marketplace. Incremental innovation is thus the avenue through which practices can adapt to changing market conditions, adopt new technologies, enhance clinical quality and patient experience, and align with strategic partners. The remainder of this talk will dive more deeply into three fundamental enablers of incremental innovation: culture, structure, and process. To kick us off with a discussion of how culture promotes innovation, I will turn things over to Dr. Rubin.
Well, hello, everybody. I hope that you're doing well tonight. And thank you, Rick, for that excellent introduction, and to Jen as well. Rick and I are going to tag team these three topics. I'm going to talk about culture, then Rick will return to talk about structure, then I'll talk about process, and then we'll open things up for some conversation. So let me start by focusing on culture and really what is required in order to achieve an effective culture for innovation is the recognition that underlying innovation is change. You can't have innovation without having change. And while innovation is one of these words that really appeals at some visceral level to people, suggesting that they're forward thinking and action oriented, change is a word that sometimes, often in fact, creates trepidation and concern, and in particular is influenced by organizational and individual inertia. So we're going to unpack those differences, particularly as we talk about building a culture that is open to innovation and thus innovation to change. And really what we're talking about is a culture for adaptation. And in order for an organization collectively to recognize the importance of being willing to change and to not being stuck in their ways, they need to be prepared to commit to self-reflection or introspection. They need to commit to seeking opportunities to advance. They have to be willing to question what they do on a regular basis, their norms. They need to be interested in consistently seeking improvement, and in order to do that, to be willing and interested in consistently gaining knowledge. So I have two columns here, one for positive characteristics and one for negative characteristics. And the positive characteristics of an organization that is an innovation-oriented organization, as we've talked about, a focus toward adapting to a changing external world, to a changing marketplace, to changes in technology, to changes in business practices, all of those domains. To be introspective, to be committed to the process of change, even though it is potentially uncomfortable and more time consuming. They also need to have an ethos of inclusiveness, and we'll talk in more detail about what I mean by that. But in order to effectively find the best opportunities, the organization really needs to be prepared to reach broadly and to respect everybody's opinion and ideas. They also need to have a sense of being willing to embrace weakness and threats from the perspective that they represent opportunities. There's a tendency sometimes for people to want to sweep the notion of weaknesses and threats under the rug and to suggest that out of sight, out of mind. But that is just the opposite. These are where the opportunities are to improve. And if innovation and improvement is a goal, then weaknesses and threats are to be embraced. And then inherent in all of this is a willingness to accept risk, to recognize that because innovation is essentially focusing activities to prepare an organization for the future, none of us can read the future perfectly. We can only make our best guesses and best determinations. And so inherently, there is some level of risk in whatever we undertake. Negative characteristics from the cultural perspective: overly prideful organizations. And the Nih syndrome, and that's not the National Institutes of Health, that is the not inventive here syndrome, is emblematic of prideful organizations. In other words, organizations that tend to be very inbred, that have a tremendous amount of internal recognition of their excellence, and consequently, their almost paradoxical unwillingness to accept any ideas that come externally. That's the Nih syndrome. And the problem with that is that many important ideas and opportunities to improve an organization come from outside that organization. And if an organization becomes overly insular, then it is not going to be positioned to take the steps to innovate. Oftentimes, organizations that have done very, very well, that have been in marketplaces where there have been few competitors, that have, for a variety of structural reasons within their broader healthcare system, if they have had an easy time being successful, then there's a certain complacency that can be born from that easy past, meaning that the general notion that we have always been fine. We don't need to worry about changing. We don't need to worry about doing anything differently now because it's never been a problem in the past. Things will work themselves out. That's the complacency that is a negative characteristic of an organization that will struggle to innovate. Fundamental to the culture that is innovation oriented is a concept known as absorptive capacity. An absorptive capacity is defined as the ability and conviction of an organization to seek and exploit outside knowledge. And that is a very fundamental and critical characteristic. There are four aspects that define the absorptive capacity of an organization. The first one is the absorptive capacity of the individuals in the organization. Knowing that the individuals have a thirst for new knowledge, have an interest in seeking ways to improve is the very first step. But simply having an organization filled with individuals who have a high degree of absorptive capacity is insufficient, because organizations are built on the premise that synergies can be realized through the interactions of these individuals, and that bringing individuals together who have different experiences and have different ideas is the way an organization makes the best decisions collectively. So communication systems are very important. It is insufficient if individuals go out and get additional training or expose themselves to things in other radiology practices or other health systems, if there isn't a way for them to come back and report out to everybody collectively, meaning that there should be a forum for people to come together and share the new things that they learn and share their new ideas. I mean, how many of you attend meetings in radiology, subspecialty meetings, or maybe you go to the RSNA, maybe you go to the annual meeting of the ACR, and then you come back and there's never a place for you to report out to your colleagues and tell them all the cool things that you just learned. That is a missed opportunity, and that is particularly a hindrance to organizational absorptive capacity. Underlying then this capability is the expectation, if people are going to communicate, that they're communicating a diversity of knowledge and experience, so that the group is hearing different things from different people. And then finally, the idea that the organization is willing to actively engage in research and development. Now, when we hear the term research and development, and particularly when we hear the term research, our minds tend to go toward the academic centers and the research programs that are formal experiments that lead to the kind of articles that we read in radiology and that are scientifically oriented. I want to highlight the fact that R&D for any practice needn't necessarily be limited in such a construct. R&D, quite simply, is the principle of being willing to test ideas and test hypotheses to see if they will have the presumed effect that has been hypothesized. So, for example, if a group wanted to determine whether or not rearranging the waiting room and providing a different environment for the patients with a greeter to improve patient satisfaction, and they had 5 or 6 sites, they might choose one, they might choose a certain time of the week, and they would pilot that, and they would look and they would see how do patient satisfaction scores change in that period of time at that location compared to some control, which would be another waiting room or that same waiting room at a different time of the week. That's the principle of R&D. And in some respects, academic centers, I think, are sometimes the most challenged to focus R&D efforts on targets toward improving the practice, toward innovating, because they're so focused on creating new knowledge and science. I think that for both academic and private practices, it's really important to put a certain amount of effort toward this type of R&D for practice improvement. When we focus and ask the question around how can we give individuals, how can we gain individual absorptive capacity amongst the members in our group or in our department, basically we should be strategic about it. We should have a strategically aligned learnings, and the opportunities are listed here: conferences, readings, observerships. They might be organ system based, they might be modality based, they might involve non-traditional competencies like going out and taking a course in hospitality in order to learn some new ideas in improving patient satisfaction, for example, or a course in IT, something along those lines. The other principle is to provide an opportunity for undirected learning, to give people a chance to encourage whatever passion they have and not to assign to them, this is what you need to go learn, this is what you need to go learn. As long as what they are out there learning has some value to the practice, and has the potential to create value, then why not? Go for it. Which basically means that this is probably not the kind of activity that should fly, and that, to coin a phrase, this is not an activity that the practice should necessarily support in the interest of expanding absorptive capacity. However, this would be. Here you see someone taking a coding class and learning to code. It may not be that this person has a specific project or ever even wants to code anything, but just having a member of the practice who understands coding, that is expanding the absorptive capacity, that's expanding the knowledge base in the group, and that helps to improve the practice. Beyond these factors, once absorptive capacity is established, it's about assimilating, disseminating, and exploiting outside knowledge. And the attitude that I'm describing in these features is the entree to this, but there are structural supports that are key. There needs to be funds made available for people to go do these activities. There needs to be a willingness to make the time for them to do that. And organizational R&D, I already talked about this topic. Now, I also mentioned that inclusiveness and openness is really key to an organization that is capable of innovating. And the principle here is that everyone in the department has something to contribute, whether they are a radiologist, whether they're a trainee, whether they are a technologist, a nurse, housekeeping, secretarial, administrative, whether they're a referring physician, hospital personnel, even patients and their families have something to contribute. Practices that leverage the diversity of experience and the stakeholders and the people who engage in their practice will have the best opportunity to assimilate ideas, to have activities that bring the greatest impact for innovation. And so having a very wide field of view in considering who to engage around innovation activities is really important. It's also important to, when trying to develop innovation, to be willing to temper or even suspend hierarchy, to let people feel comfortable bringing their voices forward, even if they're not the department chair or even if they're not a radiologist, an MD. If there is a housekeeping person who has observed certain things that have a negative impact on the daily operations of the department, you want that person to come forward and to speak up. And you want them to feel confident and comfortable that their voice will be heard, independent of what they say. Really important as a cultural perspective. The notion that there is mutual opportunity and obligation for everybody in the organization to provide input here, giving them the opportunity, but also helping them understand that it is an expectation, an obligation that they participate. And this process is a self-perpetuating process in that it promotes trust, it promotes alignment and commitment collectively when it comes down the line to do some of the heavier lifting involving the implementation of these ideas once they actually reach the implementation phase. Oops, I think I inadvertently. The last point I want to make before I turn this back over to Rick is that it's important when engaging in innovation and engaging in change that the leaders of the department in particular, but everybody as a general rule, should be open-minded and aware to understand the effects that an innovation initiative might have on individual and group competencies. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that if there is an innovation effort that, for example, let's say that in transitioning to structured reporting, that a group of senior radiologists who take great pride in their dictation skills and maybe are a little more challenged to learn new ways of reporting after doing it for so many years, that's potentially a competency destroying change for them. And that doesn't mean that the innovation shouldn't be undertaken, but it should be undertaken with an awareness that there are people in the department, people in the practice who are going to be personally disrupted, and at the worst, potentially fear obsolescence. And if those people are valued, if everyone in the organization is valued, then these considerations need to be brought to the fore up front. They should be discussed with the individuals so that they don't become barriers to innovation, that they understand that they're going to be given the time to adapt, they're going to be given opportunity to maintain their productivity, maintain their effectiveness. It's really important. There are some innovations that enhance people's competencies and some that destroy them. And thinking critically about every proposed innovation and its potential impact on individuals' competencies is an important step in order to approach the organization with the kind of emotional intelligence needed to maintain broad-based optimism and support. Finally, competency traps are something that are important to recognize. What they represent is that when folks get so good at doing something, they're just the expert at fluoroscopically guided defecography, for example, and that is their expertise. That becomes a competency trap. Maybe they just love reading MRCPs or whatever it is, starting IVs. To the extent that folks develop these competency traps, then it can be very hard to steer them toward other activities that might be better ways to do things. So having a culture of change and innovation helps to mitigate against competency traps, but just to be aware that they definitely exist in our practices. And I think that if any of us look critically at what we do ourselves on a daily basis, we could probably recognize a few competency traps that we each have on our own and think about ways that we might mitigate them so that they're not a barrier to innovation and change. So those are some issues, topics relating to establishing a culture that is amenable and ripe for innovation. And you can think about innovation, the process of innovation effectively as growing a garden and having beautiful fruits and vegetables as the rewards of the efforts. But if the ground is not prepared, if the soil is not fertilized with a cultural orientation to recognize the best opportunities for getting ideas, for implementing them, and for bringing the group along, then unfortunately nothing will grow in that garden. So with that, I'm going to turn the microphone back over to Rick.
Okay, thanks very much, Jeff. And we now pivot our attention from culture to structure. And we ask the question, what kind of structural or organizational elements are important for promoting successful innovation within a practice? The first point to be made here is there is proactive thinking and proactive setup to be done to establish the proper infrastructure for innovation, continuing this analogy of prepping the soil for growth. An appropriate analogy here would be to companies that make heavy proactive investments in research and development so as to stay on top of changing technology and market conditions as they evolve. For a radiology practice, this might mean proactive and intentional dedication of resources earmarked to innovation, including space, personnel, funding, and time. Dr. Rubin will be talking in the next section about process elements important to innovation, but it's worth asking here what kind of structural elements must be in place to facilitate innovation seen as analogous to R&D for a firm. Well, certain process steps that we would need to support would include identification of recent advances in the marketplace, evaluation of processes and technologies for possible adoption into our practice, and assessment of our own internal capabilities and gaps. These process steps cannot occur without support from certain enabling structural elements, including personnel with the key skills to perform these tasks, like coding, for example, as opposed to fly fishing, although perhaps we should debate that during the Q&A. Funding from the organizational budget, as Dr. Rubin already mentioned, and possibly protected time for innovation activity itself. Let's talk in more detail about some of these structural elements. Much has been written in the business literature about whether organizations should stand up dedicated innovation teams or whether innovation should occur more globally and holistically within an organization. Much of this debate comes down to a question of accountability versus over-compartmentalization. A dedicated innovation team may promote better results by investing a small group of individuals with accountability for outcomes, but a dedicated innovation team also risks myopia and bias if the team is too isolated from the rest of the organization. We propose that a flexible and organic structure may offer a way of overcoming this dilemma by constantly pulling individuals into the team and giving those individuals responsibility for tasks matching their own personal competencies. For example, environmental scanning for new hardware or software opportunities may favor individuals within the practice with discipline and technical knowledge. Evaluation and comparison of ideas requires analytical skills, and deployment of new procedures and technology requires other skills such as charisma, team management, and persuasion and negotiation ability. We also emphasize that, like any team situation within an organization, a well-functioning innovation team should have a clear sense of purpose, an agreed-upon set of rules, including parameters for promoting free exchange of ideas, a defined system for making decisions, and established metrics for measuring results. Strong practice governance is another important structural enabler for innovation. Although ideation and planning both benefit from broad inputs gathered from all corners of the organization, centralized decision-making with power vested in a small executive committee often promotes more agile movement and quicker decision-making. Robust communication systems are fundamental to effective innovation and crucial to achieving trust and buy-in from stakeholders, both during the innovation process and during implementation. Communication planning should address both informal and formal channels, including staff meetings, emails, bulletin boards, blogs, and newsletters. Finally, we believe that organizing to innovate includes ensuring that stakeholders are motivated to innovate. Incentives for innovation can be both economic and non-economic. Non-economic incentives can include awards, recognition, and promotion opportunities. Economic incentives may include recognition of innovation activity in year-end incentive bonuses or buy-downs of annual RVU targets. I'll now turn things back over to Dr. Rubin to discuss the innovation process.
All right, thank you, Rick. So the third component, once the culture is right and the leadership has established a structure to enable innovation, is then to use that structure to carry out a process that will advance the innovative agenda. And the big picture around process is getting it done. Getting it done meaning finding the opportunities that we've been discussing that will really provide the greatest chance for the organization to move ahead, to then collate those opportunities and to gradually evaluate them and limit them into the ones that are really ripe for implementation. And as I've already mentioned, this is a process that involves everybody. And the better able we bring our departments and extended stakeholders together in a community to carry this out, the more successful we're going to be. When it comes to discovering opportunities, the first and foremost element to assure that the right opportunities are being discovered is to assure that the department has a strategy of what it's trying to achieve. And that might sound very basic from the perspective of, well, what is a radiology department trying to achieve? Well, presumably it's trying to achieve delivering a great patient care through the acquisition and interpretation of excellent diagnostic images and the provision of image-guided therapy. But if you break it down to a greater extent and ask the kind of questions of what is the circumstances that any given department or practice finds itself in, and what are its key goals that it is trying to achieve, having those goals articulated, whether it is improving patient satisfaction, whether it is improving turnaround time, whether it is improving the acquisition of newer capital equipment, whether it is building an infrastructure that results in greater satisfaction by the radiologists, changing work hours, whatever those are, those should be articulated goals and targets, because it's easy to get focused on a shiny object, on something that seems like, well, let's work on that. That's a great idea. Or let's work on that. That other department or that other practice did that and it really worked out for them. Doing that is a mistake unless you have already tested that those activities align with the strategy that you have for your practice and the goals that you have set. You risk missing out on your biggest opportunities if you don't discipline the group to establish those goals and you go for another target that seemed to work for somebody else. And so inherent in the discovery of these opportunities effectively, the notion of being proactive versus reactive is also critical. If we wait for circumstances to reach a crisis point where something must be done, then we end up focusing all of our attention on an emergency where we may not have the time to put the best option forward, where we're just trying to fix whatever is breaking in front of us, as opposed to really looking broadly at the full scope of opportunity and trying to address them proactively. So in order to be proactive, one activity that top organizations follow is that they regularly perform environmental scans. And what is meant by an environmental scan is that a team of people will undertake a formalized project to look out at the environment, at other departments, for example, within a health system, at other practices within a geography, or perhaps across the country, and to try to understand what's going on out there. You know, what's going on from the standpoint of the practice of radiology, from the standpoint of achieving quality outcomes, quality images, quality patient experience. That's all the functional part. What is the state of the art in terms of business relationships? What do they look like? What do the contracts look like, as best as we can find out across different practices in our state and in our region? What is the culture of different practices? What is the marketplace? What partnership opportunities do we have out there? By going and asking these questions and doing this environmental scan, it doesn't mean that you're going to act on any of these points, but it provides a formalized opportunity to have a knowledge base in the practice to assure that all of this information is readily available. And going back to the communication aspects that we discussed, to share this so that it essentially infuses the process of discovering opportunities and to be able to look for opportunities in a knowledgeable fashion that not only speak to how we as an organization are affected internally, but how that might relate to what's going on the outside. Now, one construct that has been advanced as an effective means of determining what ideas should ultimately become projects and targets for implementation is this. This is the innovation funnel. And the idea of the innovation funnel is that on the front end, ideas are generated. And ideas, as we've already talked about, should be generated from a 360-degree perspective. There should be top-down as well as bottom-up, as well as external inputs in order to get the best ideas. The more ideas that we can get our hands on and shove into the funnel, the better, because it just provides a basis for comparison and decision of what we're ultimately going to do. At the ideation phase, there's no downside to just generating a ton of ideas. To have a town hall meeting, for example, of all hands in the practice, throwing out suggestions, and to have people writing them down and keeping track of every one of them to put them into the funnel. Once we enter them into the funnel, then it's a matter of deciding what it is that is going to move its way through. And that is determined by this principle of having gating criteria. You can see in this schematic of an innovation funnel that I'm showing you here, the first phase is discovery, which goes from the initial gate to gate 1, where maybe the ideas are going to be assessed to determine if they conform to the organization's goals, and if there are no major barriers to implementation. In other words, they are preliminarily feasible. And if we pass that gate, then we consider a smaller group, because we will certainly reject some ideas that are initially selected. And then we might proceed to say, well, let's do a financial forecasting on this, and let's also try to analyze what the value of this investment in change would bring. So we go through an analytical period. And if that is successful, then we might go to further analysis, looking at how it meets not only our priorities, but the organization's priorities. What are the risks associated with it? What might be the collateral impact of implementing this innovation? And then if we still feel it's a good idea, then we can go and do a testing and development phase, and ultimately determine a better sense of what the performance characteristics of the innovation will be, have a refinement of the costs, hopefully discover unforeseen barriers, and at that point, make the decision as to whether or not we're going to implement. Now, for some people, when you look at something like this, you say, oh my God, it's just so formal, there's so much structure there. And the intent of presenting this isn't to just overwhelm with a high degree of structure. What I want to convey is that this can be as flexible of a construct as anyone might choose. Firstly, ideas can flow through or be rejected at whatever rate need be. They can reside for a week, they could reside for a year until the organization is ready to move forward if an idea hasn't been rejected. The gates can be changed depending upon the circumstances, depending on the project. And so this is really mostly intended to serve as a schematic representation of how one sequentially evaluates ideas, so that when one gets to the point of investing resources to implement innovation in the interest of creating value for the practice, that you have as high a level of confidence as you reasonably can have that you have identified the best candidates. So when it comes to implementation, when it's basically been decided that this is the innovation project that we are pursuing, as they emerge from the funnel, it is often at that point best to hand the actual implementation off to an experienced project manager, somebody who has experience in creating timelines and managing multiple work groups, and in understanding the interdependencies of various elements of the project, so that the project doesn't drag on too long, so that it's not any more of a disruption to the practice as it needs to be, and so that it is concluded in a timely and cost-effective fashion. So for those of us on the webinar and listening that are radiologists, which I suspect is most of us, we have to recognize that this is the moment where we get out of the way. Our role essentially is to create a clear path for the manager to run the project effectively. So here's the analogy where we are the big offensive tackle holding the linebacker or the secondary at bay while the manager runs the ball down the field. That's essentially the principle here. And so our role is just to anticipate risks, to anticipate barriers, and to jump in and to clear those away so that the project manager can carry the project forward, maximizing the likelihood for success, anticipating whatever disruptions might come about and doing the best we can to block them out before they actually impact the manager's ability to deliver on the charge. So that is brings us to the concluding portion of the formal comments that we wanted to make. I want to stress once again that effective innovation is really critical, particularly to the rapidly evolving professional environment that we find ourselves in. There are many pressures that are affecting radiology practices today from the standpoint of marketplace, business relationships, contracting, technology adoption, workforce challenges, burnout. I mean, we can go on and on. The way to address these issues is to recognize them, to own them, and to innovate through them, to find the solutions. And the way to achieve that is to prepare the organization as a whole, to develop absorptive capacity and to lay the groundwork for a culture that is fertile for innovation, to develop a structure that allows for the effort to be committed and the sharing of ideas and the communication and the interfaces and meetings to bring people together, and then to have a process that one oversees and implements to go from the point of ideation and idea generation all the way through to determine what projects are most valuable and should ultimately be carried out. So at this point, let me turn it over to Jen, Dr. Nathan, and let you conduct the next part of the program.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. So I'd like to thank both you and Dr. Abramson for this excellent talk. At this point, we're going to start a Q&A session. So if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to ask our speakers. You can either raise your hand or you can type something in the question box. Oh, we got a question here. Dr. Weissman, let me try to unmute you. Dr. Weissman?
Hi, Jen. Hi, Jeff and Rick. Great job. Jeff, after watching your presentation, I'm still I can't believe that all organizations are now doing what you're suggesting they do. It just seems so intuitive, but the reality is not all organizations are doing what you're suggesting. So if one is not the leader of the organization, how can one facilitate what you've talked about to get a positive culture going, to prepare the organization? What are some strategies someone can do if they're not actually in charge? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ian, for that question. It's a really terrific one. And, it has a lot to do with the culture in which you find yourself in the organization. I mean, and it actually says a lot about the nature of the leader of the organization. If the leader of the organization is at least open to ideas and to listening, but hasn't taken the steps to implement these various considerations, then there's hope that one can have a conversation with that leader, or to potentially share your passion for this type of structure and opportunity with several other people that are like-minded in the group, and then to collectively go and have that conversation with the leader, understanding and being prepared to respectfully listen and to hear what barriers they might see. But I think that one strategy I would consider is to try to think about how it might be possible to pilot some element of these principles within the department, and to first and foremost find a group of individuals that you think would work well together and that want to take on an innovation project. And then to go to the leader and say, here's something we'd really like to try. We just want your approval and alignment in these efforts, and let us go through the process of discovering ideas and coming up with a proposal to implement, and sharing with you the the ideas that we have come up with. And in taking those gradual steps and working effectively as a team, you have the opportunity to both share the experience more broadly in the practice to generate enthusiasm and excitement for it, but also to essentially demonstrate the value of what you're trying to create. So those are just a few ideas that I might consider.
Okay, I had a question actually. What suggestions do either of you have for dealing with group members that may feel threatened by new opportunities? How can you get people to think a little bit more outside the box and be more accepting of innovation?
Rick, do you want to answer that one, or?
Well, I think this really goes to the points that that were made in the culture section about competency traps and about recognizing proactively what innovation is competency enhancing versus competency destroying. Individuals that are threatened by change are oftentimes individuals that perceive that they may be disrupted themselves or becoming irrelevant or somehow being marginalized by the implementation of change. I think part of the innovation process is recognizing that threat proactively and working to mitigate that risk, either by addressing the way that the innovation change is communicated, or by thinking in advance about how might an individual's competencies be turned or used in a different way to advance the purposes and the goals of the organization. Jeff, anything to add to that?
Yeah, it calls to mind a cartoon that I didn't put into this presentation, but I'll describe it. And, it's basically these two people talking. And one of them says, the last disagreeable, after we finally fired the last disagreeable employee was when we had our last original idea. And the idea of that cartoon and of that statement is simply that sometimes friction and opposing views are the energy that's needed to actually generate new solutions. And I couldn't agree more with what Rick said, and that is to not discount and to not reject dissent as it comes up, but to embrace it and support it, to approach it with emotional intelligence, and to try to understand what is the source of this dissent and work with those individuals to realize a solution that is still going to be every bit as effective, but doesn't leave them behind. If it's a matter of them being stuck in a competency trap or having a competency destroying innovation, then I think that finding a way to mitigate that can be very valuable. If they're just people that disagree on everything, then that's a little bit more challenging, and that's something that probably should be the topic of a different webinar.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else have any questions? Feel free to raise your hand or ask a question in the box. One question I actually have is, you had mentioned how openness and getting everyone to contribute is important. Do you have any strategies on how you can maybe promote that? Have you found maybe assigning tasks or giving individuals leadership roles as a way to increase that inclusiveness, I guess, or openness amongst the group? I guess that would be more a question for Dr. Rubin.
Yeah, I think that you can have inclusiveness and engagement without necessarily establishing formal roles for that. I think that if, for example, you set up a town hall meeting where it's known that everybody's expected to be there, and the expectation is that everybody is going to come with an idea, and that those ideas, even that maybe everybody is going to get 30 seconds to describe their idea, and you're going to go around the room and everybody gets a shot at it, and it all goes up on the board. I mean, I think that the inclusiveness is partly showing the respect that people's ideas are worth listening to give people the opportunity to see their ideas being written down and not discounted. And the process of going through that and having everybody see that it's unacceptable to shout down somebody's idea. It's unacceptable to discount anybody because they're different from who you are, or they have a different role. It's so reinforcing for creating trust in the culture. I think that's where inclusiveness begins. And when people see that they are respected in that way, they can be encouraged to continue bringing ideas forward and sharing and being a part of the process of improving the practice going forward.
I would second that, and I would also add that a practice or any organization can show respect for inclusiveness in subtle ways. And in subtle ways can also do the opposite. Even something as seemingly banal as the seating arrangement in a room. And this is an example that I think I first heard from Dr. Rubin, who described a meeting where all the senior physicians walk into the room and immediately seat themselves around the central desk, and then the more junior physicians take up seats along the side of the room, and then maybe some nurse practitioners and technologists and nurses maybe are standing room only in the very back of the room. And that's not the kind of physical setup, the kind of feng shui that encourages open contributions from everyone, no matter where they are in the hierarchy. So mixing up even physical seating can show a respect for tolerance and openness, and also making efforts to draw the introverts among us out. If we all know that certain people are prone to speaking up more than others during a meeting, if you pause and actually turn attention deliberately to someone who has been quiet, it's often remarkable to hear what those more quiet types have to contribute.
Yeah, Rick, thanks so much for bringing that example forward. And I just would say, recalling Ian's question, that even if the leader doesn't stand up and say, let's mix it up, you radiologists don't all sit around the table. Anybody in the department who is sitting at that table can recognize the opportunity to share their seat and to stand up from that table and to call over, some new nurse or technologist or somebody that clearly isn't in the hierarchy and say, I'd like you to have my chair. I want you to, be positioned to bring your voice forward, and to turn to the rest of the people around the table and say, what do you say? Let's mix it up. So that's an opportunity for anyone.
Perfect. Well, thank you to you both. We're getting pretty close to the end of the hour now, so just a few things you can see on this last slide here. After this webinar is completed, we're going to provide you with a webinar survey, which we'd like you to complete. Really important to get feedback from our participants so that we become have a more stronger webinar series. Also, within a week, you'll receive instructions on how you can access a recorded version of this webinar if you want to go back and review some of the important points that you did listen to this evening. And lastly, we are working on our next webinar series. This is our last webinar for the 2018-2019 Power Hour series. We plan to launch the 2019 to 2020 sometime this summer. So keep an eye out for the email with sign-up instructions. So with that, I'd like to thank Drs. Rubin and Abramson on your excellent talks. I want to thank Jen Pendo for staff support, and thank you to our attendees for participating. Have a great evening, everyone.